Okay, welcome to UNLV Library's Gaming Research Colloquium. Today's speaker is our current Eadington Fellow, Dr. Yale Belanger. Dr. Belanger and I share French names and an inability to speak French. Dr. Belanger is professor of political science at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, and author of the book Gambling with the Future, and editor of the book First Nations Gaming in Canada. Today he will talk about evaluating cultural versus economic investments of tribal casinos in historical perspective. Dr. Belanger.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it's a nice intimate gathering. I didn't want to see 150 faces, staring at me. It's 3 o'clock on a Friday, which I also have to say thank you very much for coming out. It's 66 degrees back home where I'm from, so you can understand why I was so eager to come down here, as well as get a chance to parse through the Spildy papers, which has been a really good experience from a number of different perspectives, which I'll explain very briefly. I just wanted to say thank you for the hospitality, and it's been a really good experience from my perspective. Over the last week, you haven't seen too much of me. I've been at Caesar's Palace at the annual gaming conference that Beau Bernard, as he plays a very important role in that. And so I've had a chance to present some of these findings and then rejig it for today. So hopefully the continuity is improved and it's a little bit more of an established talk than what I presented on Tuesday afternoon. One of the first things I want to clarify, I guess, is that when I'm talking about cultural and economic investments, the language of culture is not to be taken from anything other than perhaps, I guess, an anthropological or a political perspective. I'm not going to suggest that I'm an expert on culture, especially American Indian or First Nations culture up in Canada. I just wanted to get a sense of how people were investing the money that they were starting to draw from the casinos that they were starting to install within reservation communities in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. So with that in play, I just want to, like I said, establish the fact that we're just going to be talking about an economic perspective as opposed to getting into some sort of a cultural dialogue as to what all this means. Now, what I found within the Spildy papers was absolutely fantastic. And as a historical institutionalist, which is just a fancy way of saying that I'm a political scientist who likes doing history as well, I've been in lots of archives in my day, and I've had to sift through just tons and tons of material. My first couple of days here, I thought that we were going to fall into that trap and that I was going to be here every day after day going through materials, and very quickly, within about a week, I found what I'd call the mother lode of information, which was fantastic. Testimony from Native leaders from about 20 years ago who spoke before the National Gambling Impact Study Commission. So part of the reason that you haven't seen too much of me is I captured about 2,000 images and I transferred them all to my iPad, and I've had a chance to just read and read and read over the last couple of weeks, which has just been fantastic. So you may see me in the future. I won't apply for the money again. We'll leave it to some other eager academics, but I've got a timeshare at the Polo Towers, so I think I may just drop in from time to time and dig back in. Where I started from about a year ago when I had a chance to actually talk with Kate Spildy about what was in her archive, was this idea of cultural investment. Now, the literature back in the 1980s and 1990s, when we started to see Indian gaming becoming very popular in the United States, was mostly written by non-native individuals who really took a moral perspective, or what we'd call, I guess now, a deficit perspective in describing their concerns about the impact of these casinos within American Indian communities. What was often missing was the leadership's perspective in terms of how that money was translating or underwriting investment within the community, reinvigorating local development, and ultimately reinstilling a sense of pride and ultimately culture within those communities. And so it was with that in mind, the absolute absence of those voices, that Kate and I started talking about this project, and she suggested that we just take a look at what the leadership had to say at the time. And so with her guidance, I submitted my proposal, and thankfully it was accepted, and I had a chance to really dig in. And so it was with that in mind, this notion that there's been a limited effort that's been dedicated to taking a look at what a cultural investment is that I wanted to ultimately challenge. I wanted to fill a little bit of a gap and hopefully go somewhere with it. I was hoping for a paper. I've got a book at this point, which is, I guess, good and bad. Now I have to write it, but and actually think about what I want to write. But it's been a really good experience in that regard. And so what I decided to do is avoid the contemporary sovereignty dialogue and just take a look historically at how things were evolving. And so the context is the late 1990s when the National Gambling Impact Study Commission was established, and ultimately how did the witnesses who testified before it ultimately envision how their money, the revenues that were being generated, how are they going to fulfill goals of reestablishing cultural integrity, if you will. And I also wanted to get a sense of whether or not this was a universal sort of trend. Was it just the leadership that were talking about this, or was this something that the community members were also interested in pursuing? So as noted, the Spildy papers were fantastic. Ultimately, I think I reviewed about 25 of the 70 boxes that are in the collection, and I took about 2,000 screen captures for the purposes of reviewing all of the materials. What we found is that there was more than 100 leaders from 50 tribes who testified before the committee, which is fantastic. You know, it's about as primary foundation of evidence as you can find at this point in time. And as part of sovereignty within these communities, what we're finding is that increasingly they're keeping researchers out. They want to interpret it from their perspective, the data from their perspectives. And so oftentimes, and it's something that I respect completely, you're kind of held up from having access to the leadership for the purposes of talking about these issues. So the fact that that data is in the collection is absolutely fantastic. It's a fantastic repository in that regard. It's also a very important time, and I haven't seen any literature that reflects on this. It was a moment when the leaders were testifying before the commission about the development of Indian gaming and especially sovereignty within their communities. And it occurred 10 years after the Indian Regulatory Gaming Act was established, which essentially provides the roadmap to establishing compacts with states and ultimately how money can be spent within those communities. And it happened roughly 20 years after Indian gaming commenced. So once again, it was a really good moment in time for me to be here in the sense that I actually get an opportunity to take a look at what the leadership has to say and get a sense of how these things were developing at the time. Now, just to give you a very quick context as to where things were at way back in 1998, today we hear about Indian casinos and reservation casinos generating $32 billion a year in annual revenue. It's grown fantastically in the last 40 years since 1979 when we start to see bingo down in Florida developing and we see the Pequots out east establishing their institutions. But back in the day in 1998, there was 296 casinos. And as you can see in the next couple of years, those numbers drop quite substantially. So you can tell it's a bit of a, it's a delicate time. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether these casinos are going to do something effective within those communities. There's also a lot of external pressures being put on the communities, which are keeping institutions from developing. You can see that there's about $8 billion being generated in 1998. In the last 21 years, that number's grown to 32 billion. So we have to put it into context as to what the commissioners and what the tribal leaders were speaking to at the time. And then ultimately, you can see that there was 39 compacts. That's the reservation and the state coming to agreement on Class 3 gaming, which is restricted, and ultimately a compact has to be established, which is going to establish regulatory provision and ultimately how the money can be spent within the reservation communities themselves. That number would explode to 89 within a few years, but again, it's a very slow sort of gestation period at this point in time. Now, unfortunately, this is like the last piece of material I reviewed out of the some 2,000 pages, and I wish I had jumped ahead really quick because this really establishes the context for not only my talk today, but ultimately the research that I'm going to continue down the road. This is commentary from Marg Anderson from the Mills Lac Band of Ojibwe, I think in Minnesota. I had a chance to speak with a colleague of hers this week who says that she is still as active and militant about sovereignty and Indian rights as ever. Casino revenues are doing more than rebuilding our physical community. The band is also using these revenues for facilities, programs, and services that are strengthening our Ojibwe culture. Our people are rediscovering the traditions of our ancestors that give us pride in our past and vision for our future. Right there, that's the epigraph of the book. That's the moment where we can start to establish that this is more than about sovereignty. This is definitely more than just generating revenues for the purposes of establishing a baseline for service provision. This is a moment where we're starting to see people talking about reinvigorating culture. Of course, money is being utilized for those purposes, but nevertheless, as you'll see in a second, it's being used in some very unique ways. Now, just to give you some context very quickly, I mentioned the IGRA. It was established back in 1988 by Congress in consultation with what's going to become members of the National Indian Gaming Association for the purposes of opening up reservation casinos. They say here it's supposed to apportion responsibility and establish regulation. It did a pretty good job for a couple of years until an important decision, Supreme Court decision in 1996, which basically took all the teeth out of the act. Nevertheless, it's still in place today. The reason that it's important for our purposes is what it does is it establishes how the revenue can be spent within Indian communities. There's 5 points, and in particular, it's the second one that I'm most concerned with because Indian leaders have really taken it upon themselves to interpret this in a very unique fashion. The language is open to interpretation to provide for the general welfare of the Indian tribe and its members, and this is essentially where the cultural investment piece of my talk comes into play. They haven't the leaders haven't interpreted this in a very, it hasn't been interpreted in such an open fashion that it has resulted in Congress or other legislators coming down and asking very difficult questions, but nevertheless, it has been interpreted openly enough that culture is now a very important component of reservation casinos in terms of the revenues that they generate. Now, from a federal government perspective and from a legislative perspective, ultimately these are the categories or the subcategories that fit within the larger category of the general welfare of the tribe. So you can see even back in the 1980s that there was this idea that culture was going to be a very important component and that the casinos were going to be used in some way, or the revenues were going to be used in some way to help provide some support. Elders programs, which again, that shouldn't be a surprise considering the importance of elders within the communities. Daycare and early childhood development programs. It was described to me by Native leaders kind of the anti-boarding school approach. We'll actually start the children with their culture as opposed to trying to strip it from them. Educational grants, loans, and scholarships allow for post-secondary education, if you will. Culture and language programs. Once again, language, the repository of the culture. Very important for the purposes of cultural reproduction and continuing on. After school programs for the youth, burial assistance programs. This one's kind of a macabre category, but nevertheless, due to mortality rates within the communities, it was deemed important at the time to provide that assistance. And then ultimately, this one's kind of open-ended as well, programs offering culturally based alternative healthcare and treatments. Now, the one piece that was missing, and this is something that becomes really important in later years, is Congress at the time did not believe that land reclamation was that important. They believed that the reservations that had been allocated were sufficient and that realistically the casinos were not going to be so successful that the leaders in those communities would be able to reclaim the lands that had been lost over centuries of colonial control and occupation here in the United States. So with that being said, these are the more static categories that Congress assumed the monies would be spent within, or it would be confined to. Now, as I started to go through all the material, what I found interesting was that discussions of cultural investments were largely buried. And I hypothesize that when you reflect on the nature of Indian policy here in the United States, which has been aimed at eradicating culture for all these years, people aren't going to come forward and say, we're utilizing these revenues to reinvigorate our culture. Because for all intents and purposes, those Indian policies that are administered through the BIA at this point are still active. They're still relevant. So there is a subtle attack on Native cultures still, and we can see it in a variety of legal cases and Supreme Court decisions that have popped up in recent years. So to me, it's not a surprise that we didn't hear about cultural investments. Now, the information is there, but what was really fascinating was some of the key themes that popped up. Now, I'm going to assume that nobody follows this because it's very arcane material at times, but if you were to open up the newspaper over the last 6 months and read about Native American issues, you're going to see that the very same concerns that animated the speakers way back in the late 1990s before the study commission are the same issues that are animating them today in terms of their sovereignty discourse. One of the key themes was sovereignty and self-determination. What they wanted to make sure people understood was that casinos were not independent economic entities, but they were actual important elements of governance and ongoing cultural and economic development within the community. There is a tremendous distrust of United States government motives. Once again, I don't think that that should be a surprise, but a number of issues were brought up, such as treaty and trust relationship abrogation, the fact that legislators were utilizing the fact that they believed that all Indian communities had successful casinos to establish federal cutbacks to those communities. The politicization of the tribal recognition program was really important, and then the Seminole case, which I mentioned earlier. There was always concerns, and there remain concerns about state intrusion into reservation jurisdiction. Spin-off effects were really promoted, the idea being that we put casinos in that white folks don't like, but it's actually benefiting them because upwards to 2/3 to 3/4 of our employee base are non-native individuals. So that was something that was promoted quite aggressively and quite regularly. We found Native leaders were combating issues such as political and media stereotypes about what Kate Spildy described about 20 years ago as rich Indians. She calls it rich Indian racism or rich casino racism, where everybody starts to assume that all of the 500 and some tribes across the United States all have a very successful casino, and they can essentially get off of the government dole at this point in time. Poor casino regulation, fraud and corruption, problem gambling crime. The deficit approach was very evident, and you could see that Native leaders were trying to put a very positive spin on what they were doing as a way of also combating those stereotypes. And then ultimately, and this becomes an important issue today, they really wanted to impress upon the commissioners the need to allow for the development of casinos off reserves because as Joseph Kalt stated in 2002 before Congress, only about 10 tribes generated 50% of the revenue, right? What you see is that there was well over 120 or 130 tribes that were in the lowest percentiles in terms of generating revenue. And if you reflect back on that one slide, you can see that there was 296 casinos in 1996, and then there was 256 2 years later. So the fact of the matter was not everybody was making a whole lot of money. It was really confined to a number of tribes, mostly in California, the Pequots in the east, and some Florida groups at that point in time. So getting back to the idea of cultural investment, I really had to start to go through the material and obviously parse it a little bit more effectively to try and draw out some of these ideas. And what we found, and this is not a complete list, this is just thematically the most popular issues that seemed to pop up at the time. Language preservation and reclamation concerns were almost a universal issue. All the communities that had tribes or that were benefiting from revenue allocation, revenue sharing agreements, were dumping money into language preservation and reestablishing good programs. We see that elders played an incredibly important role, and that falls under that category of elders within that second overall general welfare category within IGRA. They were leading cultural revitalization classes. They were teaching at the K-12 level. We see this at the tribal college level, and we also see it just generally within the communities themselves. We see a lot of facilities being constructed, kivas in this part of the country, sweat lodges, larger longhouses, all sorts of physical infrastructure being created for the purposes of establishing centers where community can come together for cultural activities. I found this one to be really interesting. They were actually establishing institutions of cultural revitalization. Tribes were creating, and I just named 3 here, the Department of Historic Preservation or the Cultural Resources Division. I'll just say the Cultural Institute of the Umatilla because I can't pronounce that word. So what you see is that they're actually institutionalizing this to ensure that the money is being spent according to how Congress wants it to be spent, and it's being spent in a way that the community is also going to benefit from the most. I took a look online at about 15 communities, just a very random sample. And of the 15 communities I took a look at, 14 have done this since then. So this is obviously a very popular approach that took off since this point in time. Sacred site protection, not only within reservation communities, but outside where ceremonies and other important cultural events would take place. This piece here, purchasing land that's been lost through abrogation, allotment, termination, other programs over the years, purchasing those lands off reserve, whether it's contiguous to so that we can add it on, or apart from where it becomes almost like you'd call an urban reservation. That becomes very popular over time. Eventually, there's going to be a court case just settled in the last couple of years, which states that reservation leaders can go out and they can purchase these lands, but they can't put casinos on them. And why is that? Because they believe that the casinos that are off reservation are harmful to indigenous culture. The rationale doesn't make any sense, and we can talk more later if you want, but ultimately that was the decision of the courts. You can have a casino within your reservation as a piece of your governance, and it may be able to help you culturally, but if we take it off reserve, it's not going to be culturally beneficial. I'm not sure what the rationale is, but that's ultimately the decision, or a piece of the decision. And then ultimately, and this was an important piece too, repopulating the communities. Where there had been no economic development, people left, sought options and opportunities elsewhere, and now we've got the option of now coming back to those communities. Now, this, even though I say that the testimony was buried within the archive, what I found is that in 1995, the National Indian Gaming Association actually produced a very quick report to get a sense of how the money was being spent. And they identified at the time that there was a lot of cultural investment taking place. So once again, you can understand why people did not go to Congress or go before the commissioners and talk about cultural investment, because ultimately there's kind of cognitive dissonance there when you think about the establishment of Indian policy, which is still prevalent today, which seeks to eradicate culture in many ways. But nevertheless, where you see the asterisks, those categories have tremendous amount of cultural investment embedded within. It's all subsumed within those categories, but nevertheless, investments, construction of non-gaming infrastructure where culture is important, education, other, you might as well put culture there in many ways. You could see how the spending was going. And then land acquisitions. Once again, land is another one of those important elements to perpetuating culture and cultural reproduction at this point in time. Now, not many communities did this, but I was able to own charitable contributions. Basically, no charitable contributions, 2%, right? I don't know why anybody would want to, give those monies away, but nevertheless, that's part of the IGRA. Now, not many communities did this, and not many of the witnesses testified in a certain way, but there were 2 communities that identified how the money that they were receiving through gaming revenues were actually being spent. And the first one, Umatilla, of the Northwest, identified that tribal welfare and investments, they were taking 35% of all their revenues and dedicating it to that. So what it did is, or what this does is it kind of quantifies some of the more subtler elements of the testimony that emerged during this point in time. Then the Muskogee Creek, once again, tribal welfare and investments, which can really, be seen as culture in many ways. They identified that 8% of all the revenues that they were generating were actually going towards these sorts of programs. So not quite triangulation, from a rigorous perspective, but nevertheless, you can start to see that things are coming together and that the witnesses are actually testifying to what the data that some communities were presenting is actually starting to confirm. Now, what I'll do is I'll just stop with what Stan Rice, president of the board of directors of the Yavapai Prescott tribe, had to say at the time. He's reiterating what Mark Anderson had to say, and I saw this in another 3 or 4 bits of testimony. But nevertheless, it's important for our purposes because we're starting to see continuity across tribal groups. Geographically, we're seeing the same dialogue and the same conclusions developed about the importance of gambling and those facilities to the communities. And I think it's just, as we get down halfway through, there's no way to measure how important gambling has been to these communities in terms of restoring pride and hope for the future among the people who have been crushed by 2 centuries of poverty and suffering. He describes it as an intangible but very real benefit of Indian gaming that simply cannot be quantified. So with that, once again, I express my thanks for inviting me down here and giving me the opportunity to take a look at the archive. But it's really given me some ideas and ultimately a book's worth of material to think about over probably the next 18 months. And hopefully I've got something published where I can say in more formal terms, thank you once again. And I'm not taking questions, so. Oh, yes, I am.
We have time for questions, obviously, and now I have a handheld microphone. So does anyone have a question?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So at the present day, I know your research is not on that, but has it proved to be correct where the tribal nations are benefiting? It sounds like they were selling kind of hope. And has that proved to be true with the tribal nations?
In certain cases, right? When you think about the tribal casinos, you always think about Mohegan Sun, the Pequots, I don't know, $1 billion in slot revenues on an annual basis. In certain cases, yeah, they're benefiting their communities, but right now, there's about 240 tribes that are operating about 440 casinos, and realistically, there's only about, I'd say, 35 to 40 that are really taking in a king's ransom of revenues. Now, that being said, even the ones that aren't producing that much are dedicating money to cultural revitalization. And that was one of the interesting questions that Kate and I kind of mulled over is, why would some communities avoid or bypass creating infrastructure such as roads, as an example, and send money to language preservation instead, which irritates Congress? But the communities themselves are sovereign entities, and that is a direction that they want to take things. And so I don't like to make a judgment because those communities have obviously determined internally what they think is the best way of going. But in terms of the overarching promise of what Indian gaming was projecting in the 1990s, all Indian tribes would have Indian casinos and everybody would do very well and ultimately rise up economically. That hasn't been the case.
Any other questions? James.
Thank you. This is something I just have no idea about, but I'm interested.
Me either. I just.
I'm interested in sort of the First Nations, sort of how they approached this, I guess, in Canada versus here in America, because this, I think, is all American or America-centric.
Yeah, what I'm doing today is just south of 49. So.
Okay.
First Nations up in Canada.
Like, how did they approach, like, investing in their cultures there, I guess?
Yeah, I guess the environment is completely different, right? Like, as an example, one of the highest producing in Saskatchewan, right next to me in Alberta, right? We've got the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. They operate, I think, 7 casinos, and they generate $84 million on an annual basis. Like that, I think that in Alberta, those numbers are roughly 100 million, and that's 5 casinos. So 12 of the nation's 18 First Nations casinos generate roughly $200 million. And then there's a big one in Ontario. The numbers don't even compare. And so what you see is the money is being directed more into infrastructure. Water and sewage systems are a really big thing. The history of the Canadian government with First Nations is not so divergent from down here, but nevertheless, there was a greater push for infrastructure down here than there was up in Canada. And so we're seeing the money spent more on those sorts of capital projects at this point. Now, money does get spent when it's left over. It gets redirected into cultural revitalization programs. The culture Again, it's tough for me to say, but just generally, the culture is stronger based on how the First Nations leaders talk about these issues. We're down here, it's suffered more under federal administration. So there's not as much of a need to direct money to those programs. But again, that's I'm trying to nuance what is a very complex issue, ethnographically. But yeah, it's apples and oranges in terms of what's produced down here compared to up in Canada.
If no one else has a question, I have a question. When the tribal communities negotiate their compacts with their states, is their investment in the tribal community specified in, or do they just have to follow congressional guidelines about how that money is spent?
Yeah, IGRA at least has a little bit of teeth left in terms of prohibiting the state from directing how the reservations choose to spend their monies. Where the states are benefiting, though, and Connecticut is a fantastic example, but California, Oklahoma are in the same boat, is by establishing revenue sharing agreements whereby the reservations have to pay a tithe to the state for the purposes of operating their casinos. In Connecticut, for example, I think that the state gets $288 million a year as revenue that's shared with them because they claim that they're losing money on a variety of different issues, infrastructure, problem gambling, payments, those sorts of things. But for the most part, once the reservations have the compact in place and those provisions are put in place, whatever remains is ultimately under their sovereign control, and they can choose to spend it how they see fit within the context of the IGRA guidelines.
And are they accountable? Do they have to report to anybody?
Yeah, there's the National Indian Gaming Commission, which is responsible for oversight of all of the Indian casinos within reservations. And as an oversight body, they provide a regulatory regime. They got to take a look at quarterly reports. How the money is being spent is, excuse me, it's scrutinized. And I have not seen very many moments down here where the NIGC comes out and actually fines a community for, I wouldn't call it misappropriation, but spending outside of guidelines. It has happened. Up in, I think it was Minnesota or Wisconsin recently, a tribe was fined $8 or $9 million for that, or South Dakota, I can't remember, but they were ultimately fined for directing money right into people's pockets under the auspices of this is a program. And so they were hit, but it's not a frequent thing down here. Regulation is strong, and that's something that came out of the Study Commission in 1998.
And my last question, the 1996 Supreme Court decision that, as you said, took the teeth out of the initial IGRA in 1980. What was the issue on which the Supreme Court decided to make that decision?
Okay. My knowledge of American constitutional, frameworks is a little suspect. What I recall is that with IGRA, there was a provision put in place that if a state chose not to negotiate in good faith with a tribe, the tribe had the option of taking that state to court to sue them into good faith for all intents and purposes. I believe it was, Florida, supported by California, Oklahoma, and a variety of other states, came forward and said, based on the 11th Amendment, the state cannot be sued within that context because it violates their sovereign rights as a state. And so where IGRA was trying to recognize Indian tribes' sovereignty and, I guess, compel the states to at least negotiate in good faith and not take advantage by taxing those communities, the Supreme Court in Seminole came back and said, no, it's a violation of the 11th Amendment. And that ultimately took the teeth out of IGRA because what it did is it left the tribes now vulnerable to the states who had the right to say yes or no in terms of how they would move forward with a compact. And that's where you're seeing these tremendous taxation provisions. They call it revenue sharing, but when you're having to pay $300 million a year, $120 million a year, that takes a bite out of a project that was established to help reinvigorate these communities in the first place.
Thank you. Anything else? And if not, we thank you very much.
No, thank you.
And please join us for our next Eadington talk, which will be sometime.